But the invitation came for the 50th anniversary. I just couldn't believe it, because when we left the village, it was a very poor, small village where they could hardly afford anything. And all of a sudden, they invited us to come, and they sent us tickets for the trip, and they paid for our stay in the hotel in Hitayoshi. It was just unbelievable.
In 1935, Ella Wiswell and her husband moved into a remote village in southern Japan. They were the first ethnographers to make a live-in study of a Japanese community. Today, that community, Suemura, advertises itself as the mother of all villages, where anthropology first met up with modern Japanese life.
But the young people, then looking at the agricultural photographs, of course had never seen any agricultural photographs in family albums, pre-war ones. It is important, I think, to see how exotic the Kurusu I first encountered is to young people in Kurusu today. It's like a foreign country.
Private Robert J. Smith, U.S. Army, went to Osaka in 1946 as an interpreter in the 25th Division headquarters. Later, as a graduate student, he returned to central Japan to investigate religion and society in a community called Kurusu. For his decades of writing and teaching about Japan, in 1993 he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun. But I sort of knew about where we used to live and turned off and drove to what I thought was probably about the right distance. And here was a supermarket with a parking lot, so I said, well, I'll pull in the parking lot and get out and look around. And sure enough, there was the house right beside the parking lot. You know, this had been all paddy fields.
Paddy fields, right.
Military duty also first took me to Japan in the early 1950s. And like Bob Smith, I returned as a student to carry out my first research. It was among rice farmers at the foot of the Japan Alps. Now I study fishermen and divers on the Pacific coast. Japanese often ask me and my colleagues to tell them if we perceive any continuity in what they perceive as decades of restless change. When the three of us get together, we inevitably talk about how Japanese lives have been transformed almost in front of our attentive eyes. But we talk even more about the changes in what Japanese have come to expect from us, the new positions we must take so that we can go on being witnesses to the human comedy of appetites for change. One of the best examples that I can think of how that is changing is sitting right next to me, Ella Laurie Wiswell, and the ways that her relationship have changed with the village of Suemura since 1935. In recent years, there's been a 50-year celebration, including souvenir postcards of the anthropologist and his wife 50 years earlier. The pamphlets included visits by Governor Hosokawa, later Prime Minister Hosokawa. Ella, how does all this feel to you, to be seeing all these changes?
Well, it was very touching, and most of it was unexpected. I really didn't know that anything like that would happen.
Bob, what about for you and the village of Kurusu?
Actually, I go back whenever I can, usually every 2, 3, 5 years, and always hook up again with the people I knew well and check out who has exited the scene and who's had grandchildren and all the rest of it. And it's a continuing relationship of a rather more distant sort than Ella has had with Suemura.
Well, what makes this so fascinating is not just that a whole scholarly industry has grown up about Suemura. That we find in the whole business of restudies of communities in many places around the world. But this media industry, and then furthermore, the village itself now holding as one of its points of pride the fact that it was the first community studied ever by anybody in the Japanese setting.
Yeah, I'm told there used to be a signboard at the entrance to the village in the old days saying, the village studied by John Embry. And I don't know whether Ella and I have ever discussed this, but I think Suemura is the only mura, the only village left in Japan after the amalgamation of villages.
That's right. They mentioned that because all the small villages lost the name and became part of a larger community.
Yeah.
And Suemura refused to do that because they didn't want to lose their...
They would no longer be Suemura. But it seems to me one of the complications that arises then as these new relationships evolve has to do with how we become witnesses for Japanese as well as for our American or other home audiences.
When I go back to Kurusu, one of the things I discover is that the younger people are sort of interested in talking to me about what it used to be like. They would never talk to their parents or their grandparents about it. There's a British novel, the first line of which is, "The past is another country, they do things differently there," which I think speaks well to this situation.
Well, similarly, when I've shown some of my photos even from, let's say, the 1970s, but particularly from the 1960s of rural communities that I've studied, I've had younger Japanese students in my classes sometimes look at them and say, "It looks like Vietnam." You know, in other words, a sense that somehow this may not even any longer be part of their own cultural roots. It's so distant, so different.
And of course, Ella's photographs are so far back compared to ours. Pardon me for saying so.
Can be helped.
It can be helped, right?
But cameras, I think that's been a big change. By the time I do my first field work in 1959, most families have at least a simple camera of some sort. So I was not pulled into the kind of village photographer, unofficial photographer role that both of you were.
Well, yes, in 1935, nobody in the village had a camera, and so no matter what the occasion was, either John or I had to take it. When a woman would like to send her picture back to her son in Manchuria, she would ask me to come in and take a picture of her. Or when there was a new baby in the family, they always asked me to come back, please, and take a picture.
You know, anthropologists are trained not to step on local toes. So I was invited to my first funeral, and I went with the priest who had invited me, and I arrived at the house, and somebody came out of the house and said, "Where's his camera?" So I was sent back to get my camera, and I took photographs of the funeral ceremony in the house, the funeral ceremony on the roadside, and then started to go back to Kurusu, and they said, "We're going to the cremation ground." So I wound up climbing the hill behind the coffin and filming the cremation. When I went back in 1975 to Kurusu, I took along the photographs I had taken in 1951-52, and one of the big deals, because I was the official cameraman, was the sawmill owner's son's wedding. And they said, "You got pictures of the Sadachi wedding?" And I said, "I did, of course." So they were looking through it, and I was expecting comments about the bride's costume and about this and that. I don't know why I expected certain things. The only thing that they really were interested in was the food that had been served, because nobody believed that they had been able to afford sushi in 1951. The ceremonial occasions were very important, but I think the photographs that have really lasting value are the working photographs, people at work, which they had nothing of from before the war.
Well, this has been such a big change since 1951, say. I mean, now the national image of the Japanese all around the world is they're the ones carrying the cameras.
Right.
If there's such a thing as Japanese ethnic dress, it's not the kimono, it's the camera.
It's the camera, quite so.
And within recent years, a memorable year, not too long ago when I went back to Shima, and as I started to unpack, some of the guys around were openly and very vocally clucking and saying, "What's with this guy? He doesn't have a video camera." They all had video cameras, you know, this backward American.
Right.
And there was even a little edge to the teasing. It was sort of, you know, we're being subjected to technologically inferior research here. Why aren't we good enough that he's got a video camera? Then, you know, they offered to loan me
Their cameras.
you know. Well, it's such a change from the discussions that you get among our colleagues about how it's terribly important for the anthropologist to loan his camera to the natives so that he can get the natives' image of what's going on. Well, I should loan my camera to anybody in Japan?
Never. Never.
Although all of these physical changes, I think, are fascinating and important. I think they're bringing on a dramatic changeover in the whole rhythm of life patterns, lifestyles, human relations. To give a simple example, nowadays nobody's home during the day anymore. Everybody is out. Maybe an occasional granny is still in the house. Well, you can't just drop by your neighbors anymore for a chat for a while in the afternoon because they aren't there. Everybody's off working, in school, in preschool, so that mother can be working.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Kurusu is the same way. The place seems abandoned during the daytime. The young couples, middle-aged couples, commute to work in Takamatsu or some nearby smaller town. And what you've got is grandparents watching after small children because the government pours money into the local school system to keep families somehow in the countryside if they possibly can. But the whole business of meeting people on the path or stopping to chat by the side of the field is absolutely gone because all the agriculture is done on weekends, since people are busy the rest of the time.
Of course, they do less and less regular agriculture. Well, everything is done by machine, so it doesn't take that much time, and so they can all have outside jobs.
But it does seem to me that the kind of just wandering around that you did so much of in 1935, just sort of drop in casually, you see somebody at home.
I don't think that would be
much of it.
possible at all.
No.
And of course they do traveling. As I said, we were the first foreigners they ever saw, and nobody ever dreamt of being out of the village. But today, whole groups of people from Seymour have been here
In
and
Hawaii.
have come in, going on a tour or a special trip, and
Yeah, I was back in Kurusu a year ago, about a year ago now, and dropped in to see a family that I had known because it was a Sunday. I knew that they'd probably be home and there was no big agricultural thing going on. And I asked how things had been, and they said, well, we just got back from Canada. And I said, where in Canada? And they said, well, we really liked Montreal and Quebec. But the notion that the children and grandchildren of the people I knew so well 45 odd years ago could go any further than, say, Osaka at a maximum. They simply were bound by the inland sea, basically, the eastern end of it. Travel was simply out of the question, except, of course, we do forget all the people who had been in Manchuria and Taiwan and China and even Southeast Asia. I mean, there were world travelers around in that sense.
something else.
It's one of the complications that now arises, and I don't think we have any standard procedures for dealing with it, is that Japanese images about the village past often are very different from what you or I, or certainly Ella, saw. But it seems to me this leads into a number of larger issues that then involve us as witnesses, as erstwhile residents. And one of them, my label for it is the Victorianization of Japanese life. I think that down until probably Kurusu, certainly Suemura, for some people, yet in some rural communities, life is much more Elizabethan.
I see, yes.
And I think it's become more and more Victorianized. And both of these things raise strong feelings on the part of all sorts of people, ourselves included.
Well, that's a tough one because Ella's field materials pose that, I think, quite directly. When the Sankei Shimbun did a story on the book, I didn't want them to do a story on the book, and I refused the interview a couple of times, and finally the guy prevailed upon me. The headline said, "Sex and Shochu," which displeased me no end. But for city folks these days, it came as obviously a revelation.
In many parts of rural Japan, it was not unusual to live together before marriage. Trial marriages, if you want to call them that, of various sorts. And this was true in the Shima region, where I've been doing research in recent years. Well, every so often I have this very interesting experience where some visitor from the city is introduced to me and he realizes I'm doing this research, and obviously this foreigner can't really understand the local setting.
Of course not.
And so he will take me aside and say, does the professor really know that in the old days people used to sleep together before marriage here? But it was part of marriage patterns in a situation where women had not only a high status, but a high income occupation such as shellfish diving.
Right.
Their parents didn't want them to leave all that soon.
Right.
Marriages, as you know, were not registered for weeks, months, years even.
Well, certainly in Ella's and my book on the women of Suemura, that pattern is fairly.
Sometimes they didn't register until the first child was born.
Yeah,
That was the system.
Right. To make sure that the marriage had a reason.
And the trial marriages, the marriages where they spent a few days in the new husband's place
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
went home again.
Was very common.
Also, the number of divorces that took place was incredible.
Well, here's another part of post-war mythologizing. You know, Japan is so famous worldwide now for having such low rates of divorce.
Right.
Before the war, they were among the highest of all industrial nations.
That's right.
Yeah.
Ellie, you remember that documentary about women's lives that was done a few years ago in Suemura? I know you feel that some of the scenes in there simply do not reflect what you knew of Suemura and women's lives there in 1935.
That's right, because they it was all artificial. During our day, there was a lot of drinking in Suemura. Everybody drank all the time, and no matter what the ceremony was, what the event, what the work was, as soon as the work was finished, you had to have a party. But only older women drank. And they were then, there was always music and dancing after that, and only the older women did the dancing. Even the rather, shall we say, outspoken dancers, not very decent ones, but they were done by older women, and somehow or other, everybody being drunk, and the woman being slightly drunk, but all, it didn't seem to be vulgar, it just seemed to be a part of the ceremony. But this documentary, which was done, they made the young women imitate the dances that had been done by older women, and the fact that the younger women did it looked very strange and rather shocking to me, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I think the Kurusu people were protecting me since I was such a young man. When I first read Ella's field notes, I thought to myself, well, nobody ever told me about those things when I was doing my field research, but I recognized instantly what one might describe as the earthy humor. The women working in the fields particularly were likely to make remarks at passing young men, including me, and most of them I didn't understand, but I understood the implication of a lot of what was being said. And what it reminded me of, in fact, was the lusty kind of farmer humor that I knew from Missouri. I was born on a farm.
Sure.
And the difference was that it was so open, and that it was between men and women, which in the case of southern Missouri, that was not the case.
You know, the women shellfish divers that I've worked with over the last few years strike me as the women of Suemura in that respect very much. The same kind of earthiness, for lack of a better term, teasing men mercilessly, including the professor, in all sorts of ways. Visitors are often shocked not only by that, but by the women's speech patterns, because they talk like men. They talk like truck drivers. But in context, it makes perfectly good sense. Like longshoremen, they are doing very dangerous work. They are very dependent on each other. This kind of brusqueness, loud voices and whatnot, I think is part of heavy labor under difficult circumstances, probably anywhere in the world. But it just blows all your stereotypes of the nice Japanese lady speaking softly.
Well, Ella has a wonderful story about John's interpreter and his reaction to this very effect in Sue.
Yes, because he was such a young man from the city, and he was shocked at the humor, and they teased him unmercifully. He lived upstairs in our house, and the maid also slept there, so they always asked him whether he slept with the maid, and of course Sana-san just blushed and was shocked at that question.
I think this complicates our relationship towards Japanese in general then. I don't want to be accused of being that dirty old man who's painting this evil portrait of portions of Japan, and yet I feel obliged to say these things are there, they're real. They're part of an integrated way of life. I can't
Yeah.
describe the community and pretend they're not happening. I don't want to over-focus on them. I don't know. How do you handle this?
Well, it's a very sticky wicket because the material that I run into that poses that problem is the material on the Burakumin.
Okay.
And if I have Japanese students in my class, they tell me I shouldn't discuss the whole Buraku outcast situation, and I tell them that's part of Japanese society, and I'm sorry about that. The only time I ever really came to grief was when it turned out one of the students in my class was Burakumin, and that was really very tough to handle. But I'm not in the business of prettifying Japanese society, which has many flaws, it seems to me. You just I think you have to just do it, and I try to.
What's been the reaction of Japanese to the translation of The Women of Suemura?
I don't know what the reaction is. Have you had any at all?
Yeah, I've had some. The overall, I think, important reaction is that it is invaluable, irreplaceable material. There's simply nothing like it, no parallel at all. And universally, it is a wretched translation. The translator also has a very hard case of what do gaijin foreigners know about Japan and what can they possibly understand. He called Ella on several of her observations, to which I thought her entirely appropriate response was, "Were you there?"
Yeah.
And what he was saying was, Japanese don't behave that way, and they do. I mean, she was there.
Bob, how do you think this is going to change with a new generation? I mean, we're obliged at our age to start thinking of new generations
Of anthropologists?
of anthropologists,
Yeah, well,
foreign ones, working
right,
in Japan.
like, for example, our students.
Yes.
Actually, one of the things that concerns me a little bit is that most of my graduate students in anthropology seem to be able to see only the warts and blemishes in Japanese society. I mean, they're really interested in Japanese racism, they're
Yeah.
really interested
Yeah.
in the untouchables, they're fascinated by mistreatment of women and foreigners and minority groups and all the rest of it. And I keep saying, you know, there is a kind of large structure there of everyday life, which millions of people participate in. How about some of that? And they say it's too complicated. But the difference between in quality of current pedagogical stuff on the language and what we used is simply, they're light years apart. It's simply incredible. And I think it's important that our students pick up and that more Americans realize the Japanese expectations of us are really quite high these days.
Yeah.
Ella was lucky because she could get it as while growing up.
Yes, well, I don't think I would be able to do anything today because my Japanese has become very, very rusty. But it was difficult at the beginning too. I mean, I spoke just everyday Japanese and I had to catch on to the Kumaben a little bit. But I had no trouble. I think I didn't speak absolutely correct Japanese all the time, and I think now when they recall about my visit, they say that they sometimes thought that I said little things a little strangely, didn't say them just right, and I quite agree. But they had no trouble understanding me at any rate.
Right. But these people have got to spend 4 or 5 years being able to really handle the language in ways that I never could.
Well, I wouldn't let a student go now without preparation, because it would be so disastrous. But I'm optimistic. You know, may not like the senses of problem that that almost dominate, I think, the current generation of students. But I'm optimistic with the kinds of preparation that they're getting, that so many of them now, thanks to the JET program and other exchange programs, are coming into graduate school already having 2 or 3 years living in Japan, working in Japanese organizations. They're already at least as good, if not better, a level of language skill than I had going out of graduate school.
No question about it.
It seems to me that more and more field research is going to be involving people who are actually working members of Japanese organizations in a way that you and I probably could not have been. Because I tried sometimes.
No,
And said, you know, give me some real work,
right.
so I can be part of the organization. And all right, we'll give you some real work. you're our interpreter if any foreigners come, you know,
Yes, right.
things like this.
Yeah. No, I can't tell you how astonished I was the first few times American students came to me and asked about, you know, job prospects in Japan, because it had never occurred to me that it was possible for an American to work for money to support him or herself in Japan until the 1960s sometime.
Oh, unthinkable in the
Yeah,
1950s.
absolutely unthinkable. And certainly not in the 1930s, I expect, except for people who had made businesses in Japan,
Yeah.
but not students, surely.
The community is no longer over there somewhere. Physically, part of it is over there, but people are coming to visit all the time. I think in the case of some of my students, they're involved in ways that I couldn't have imagined in 1959.
Oh, absolutely.
The best example is a student who's doing field research now, who has been hired by the town hall as a regular town employee in town hall for 2 years.
Good Lord.
They know he's come to do a dissertation, but they're willing to support him to do this dissertation so long as he in return then performs various services. Where are the boundaries anymore? You may have seen some of those cartoons that appear every so often in the American media that show what's obviously a tribal scene where a ceremony is going on, but there's a hitch and everybody has stopped, and one of the tribal elders turns to a younger person and says, "Go read what Margaret Mead says we do at this time." The image of an anthropologist often has been that he or she goes to a distant culture and comes back and reports on it to people back at home. And that's part of the job. But when the anthropologist has been involved, as the three of us have for decades, with the same community, that relationship as witness to the human condition changes and is continuing to change in all sorts of wonderful ways.